All right, good morning. So, you might not know, but inscribed above the entrance to the IRS building is a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes, which was taken from a dissenting opinion he wrote for the Supreme Court in 1827. Taxes, he noted, are what we pay for a civilized society. But as Justice Holmes and countless others have found, one person's civilization is another person's savagery. Taxes are about values as much as they are about economic theory and policy design. They reveal our beliefs about what's worth investing in and whether and to what extent government should be trusted. Taxes and tax breaks and tax credits can influence people's behaviors, such as consuming alcohol or purchasing a home, or even entering the workforce. They can promote investments in social goods like affordable housing and medical education. And of course, they can pay for services, as Bobby described, everything from trash collection to pre-K to Social Security. Like many in public health, I cut my teeth on tax policy through sin taxes. Before joining the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, I and a small group of colleagues in Philadelphia worked unsuccessfully to tax sugar-sweetened beverages in 2010 and 2011. The first time it was to raise revenue for general city services and obesity prevention programming. The second time was to support full-day kindergarten. Through that experience, I learned a couple things. First is that soda companies and supermarkets are very good storytellers, that establishing a new tax is much harder to do than increasing one that already exists, and that regressivity is relative. Each time the sugary drinks tax was not passed, the property tax was increased and essential services were cut. You may not be aware that properties are often overvalued in low-income communities in big cities. So when property taxes are increased, those neighborhoods see a disproportionate burden. So while we fell short on soda twice, Philadelphia was eventually successful. And we did institute a local $2 per pack tax on cigarettes in 2015. And not surprisingly, that helped close disparities in smoking, both socioeconomic and racial and ethnic. And it also raised money for public schools. But this is just one small tale in a much, much larger story. And as you'll soon hear from Pete Davis, our first speaker, tax policy and its implications for health go well beyond sin taxes. I was also going to point out the typology that Bobby showed you. I think that's going to be a really important document for you to continually refer back to as you hear from speakers today. Pete is really the ideal person to lead us through this unforgiving but ultimately really rewarding terrain. Pete advises Wall Street money managers on Washington policy developments that affect financial markets. He's president of his own consulting firm. And in that work, he draws on 11 years of experience as a prominent Capitol Hill economist, first with the Joint Committee on Taxation, then the Senate Budget Committee, and then working for Senator Robert Byrd. He has worked in both the House and the Senate for both Republicans and Democrats. That's an increasingly unique feat, so it's a real treat for us to have him here. Among his many, many accomplishments, he formulated the 1975 tax rebate, the Earned Income Tax Credit, one of my favorites, the 1976 estate tax rates, the 1978 marginal tax rates, and the Roth-Kemp tax cut. So it would behoove you to listen to him. I think all of us have something to learn, as we saw from the poll this morning. And while you're listening, as I mentioned, take a look at that typology of taxes and think about the principles that Pete walks us through. Think about how you can apply them to the work that you do or that your organization or your community does. Make note of what you want to learn more about or what you might need clarification on. And for those so bold, think about what points you may want to challenge Pete on. He's going to challenge you for sure. He's promised that he wants to keep this session very, very interactive, so he will be taking questions and answers throughout. So without further ado, please help me welcome Pete Davis.
I like to walk around when I'm talking. Thank you very much for having me. The next 50 minutes, we're going to talk about the principles of tax policy and how well or poorly they are adhered to today. And I want to keep this interactive like a seminar, so I'll ask you questions, you ask me questions, and we'll, in 50 minutes, hopefully reach a point where in the future you'll feel comfortable asking the right questions when somebody's proposing something, and where you will be well aware of the pitfalls that arise with any tax policy. I always like to start my talks with a takeaway. The takeaway here is that tax policy is a balancing act among competing objectives, which always create winners and losers, and which, just like that great Western, Clint Eastwood, The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, that's what you find. I didn't learn my tax policy in a classroom. I was a young kid who, at 23, knew computers and how to model. And in the middle of Watergate, the Joint Committee on Taxation had Mr. Nixon's returns, knew he was going down because he cheated like crazy, and they didn't trust Treasury to use this new model that was producing all these parameters for the tax policy that the Congress would just adopt and put into the law. And so I literally walked out of Treasury in March of 1974 with a magnetic tape in my arm, went behind the fish in the basement of the Commerce Department back when the aquarium was there, and rented time on a UNIVAC and started cranking up estimates of how much tax amendments and changes in tax policy cost, and what we could do to improve the income distribution and things like that. And I learned tax policy on the fly. So when people ask me, well, gee, how do you know all this, and how can you really say this about tax policy? I always tell them that if you took off my shirt, you'd see the tire tracks. And every time I needed to know anything, I'd walk across the street to Longworth, and the lawyers who had all graduated first in tax at Harvard Law School and other top law schools around the country would give me a quick seminar on what I needed to know to go back and simulate it on the computer. So what do we know about winners and losers? Anybody look at my paper? What did Machiavelli say? Losers hate to lose 2 or 3 times more than winners like to win. So if you're going to sell a policy at any level of government, local, state, federal, you've got to not only show that you've got some really good reasons for it, but you have to show that the winners are a lot more numerous and wealthy, have more political capital than the losers. That's a very tough standard, a very tough standard. Okay, so what are the principles of tax policy? Well, the first one is the chicken across the road question. Raise revenue, right? Every government has to raise revenue. And so what's the flip side of that? Well, the flip side of it is giving what I call tax loopholes, and I don't mean that to be as pejorative as it sounds. Again, good, bad, ugly. There are plenty of good tax loopholes. There's a lot more bad ones, and there's some really ugly ones, which you will soon hear about. The next principle is, if you're going to have a tax and it's going to be supported by the public, which is kind of important, the public has to be pretty well convinced that it's a fair tax. So back to Bobby's slide about the Boston Tea Party, what happened there? What were the British doing in the colonies? They taxed tea, but if you owned a house in Philadelphia and you had some guests with red coats, yeah, you were occupied. And it was very expensive to occupy the colonies. And so, the House of Commons, very, very rationally as they thought, well, we ought to get the colonists in America to pay for the privilege of being protected from the Indians by our troops. except the troops weren't always just protecting them against the Indians. And so anyways, they slapped on the tea tax, and that basically started this country. And so taxes are at the core of government, and that's why you have such really knockdown, drag-out battles every time you talk about the slightest change to tax policy, just like in the 1966 Clint Eastwood movie, The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. And there are no real good guys here, and the bad guys are pretty bad, but even they have, you know, like I tell people, hey, I was always glad when the lobbyists would call me up because sometimes they could tell me something I needed to know and I didn't have to spend hours trying to figure it out. And some of them, you know, I would call up and ask, hey, what's going on with this particular transaction in these kinds of companies? And can you explain it to me so I can understand how to model it on the computer? And that's the kind of interaction you need. So, you know, lobbying is an important function, but again, you know, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. So, how do we define fairness? Well, one way is what we call vertical equity, okay? That means ability to pay. The rich should pay higher taxes than the poor. That's a progressive income tax. That's what we have. However, when you throw on payroll taxes in this country, it turns out that our progressivity is not so great. We tend to have actually pretty high taxes on the poor. Then it kind of goes into a U shape and comes back up at the high end a bit. My brother runs money for a billionaire in Bellevue, Washington. I go up and talk to the tax lawyers up there every now and then. These are really sophisticated people. There are a lot of rich people who don't pay much tax. They can arrange their affairs as to when they get paid, and they can set up foundations, and they can do all kinds of great things. You know, cure malaria, you know, which Bill Gates is doing. But they don't pay a whole lot of tax, and their companies don't pay a lot of tax. So that gets us into the second principle of fairness, horizontal equity. If you and your neighbor both have similar circumstances and similar income, you should pay the same tax. That's pretty simple. Do we have that? Not really. Simply, taxes should be simple. They should be easily enforced. They should be easily understood. Well, I was one of the first economists in drafting sessions with all the tax lawyers in Canon and over on the Senate side, and boy, simplicity was the first principle to go in every drafting session I was ever in. I'll tell one quick story. If I get going on too many stories, we won't get through my stuff. But this, I'm new on this staff. I'm in the drafting session on ERISA. Okay, ERISA is sort of all the pension law, 1974. And a guy, a joint committee attorney who I guess I better not name, was sort of the main author of ERISA, right? And we're in there with the House Legislative Counsel, you know, and he's this revered guy who's been there forever, and he knows everything in the U.S. Code. And he tells this lawyer over lunch, go out and come back with a 4-page definition of whatever it was, you know, to put into the law, on pension law. And so the lawyer goes back to the front office of the Joint Committee, calls in every secretary from the whole staff. And so 20 secretaries show up. They bring in there all these electric typewriters. And he comes back at 2 o'clock in the meeting when it reconvenes to draft the law. And he's got a 40-page definition. And I'm sitting there and I'm kind of trying to stay awake because I've been working day and night and haven't had enough sleep. And I just had a big lunch. And all of a sudden, the House Legislative Counsel, this revered guy, Ward Hussey, picks up the 40 pages, throws them at the lawyer, and kicks him out of the room. Well, guess what? Do you know how many pages the tax code is now? It's like 7,000. I mean, it's just like even tax lawyers can't even keep up with it. And I have trouble. There's a lot of stuff I don't understand about the tax law, and I've spent my whole career working on it. So I'm not trying to make you an expert here. I'm just trying to give you the sort of the lay of the land and the right questions and so on. The last principle of tax is efficiency. And what that means is, does it cost you a lot of money to collect that tax? And does the tax create incentives that help or hurt the economy? So for example, our current federal tax code has all kinds of incentives for real estate. And so we have all this massive amounts of money going into helping people like me who are pretty well off. I'm in the top 2%, not quite made the 1%. Living in a multi-million-dollar home, 5 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, just me and my wife. Now, my stepdaughter, who's a 35-year-old OBGYN in suburban Washington, and my stepson, who's finishing his 3rd-year residency up at Mass General in neurology, they're still renting. And renters pay a subsidy indirectly through the U.S. tax code for me and for everybody who owns a home. Now, is that right? So that's a violation of the vertical equity. It's a violation of horizontal equity. And so one of the themes of the talk is that every time you touch anything in the tax code, you're probably violating one or more of the principles. And so it's a balancing act. You're trying to sort of, one of the best papers I ever studied in grad school was the theory of the second best. And when I worked on the Hill, I don't think we even got to the second best. I think we just sort of got to the third best and the fourth best, but at least we were trying to get to a best. So, okay, so those are the principles. And I've convinced you that the U.S. tax code doesn't do a very good job of it. And, you know, the state taxes, you know, 41 states have income taxes, not counting 2 that just tax interest and dividends. Most of them in various, yes, go ahead.
So back when
Yeah. Right.
obviously violate most hard to know how it's being violated.
Amen. A gentleman makes a really good point that transparency should be a principle. I defy anybody to find transparency in the U.S. tax system. And in fact, I just had a Harvard grad student email me, can we get together and talk about transparency in government and whether it's a good thing that markups in the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee are open to the public. And I attended the last closed markup of the Ways and Means Committee in '74. And it's an interesting topic because what happens when you have public markups of tax bills? Gucci Gulch, right? You know, I was there that night. 1,000 lobbyists lined up. It doesn't matter how late, they're going to be there. And the committee will be considering an amendment, and all of a sudden a few members will get up and walk out. And they'll go out the back door. And if you're out in the hallway with all the Guccis, you know, and a lot of my friends are in that crowd, are kind of walking around to the member back door and have a little conversation, and then they come back in, and you know, then they vote, and when you have open markups, it causes problems because members basically will not cross certain powerful economic interests, and so, in my opinion, they don't necessarily, you know, on the face of it, you would think, hey, if you make them mark up a tax bill in public, that's a good thing. It's transparent. What it really does is it makes the members more vulnerable to all the pressure groups. And so then, if you're in the back room with the staff like I was, and it's the day before the markup, what are the members doing? They're in the back room sort of rehearsing what they're going to do when they get out on camera. And one of the interesting things for the staff is, how well did they do? I mean, they made decisions back here, but then they got out on camera, and sometimes they're the same, and sometimes they're not. And so, government, especially in a democracy, and especially in the United States, is a very messy process. You know, Bismarck was right. You don't want to see the sausage made. I have seen better policy emerge from a closed process sometimes. Now, having said that, for sure, there are plenty of little giveaways that sneak in and when it's behind closed doors. One more story and we'll get back to my paper. I'm sitting there in committee, on camera, Ways and Means Committee, it's 75, 76, and my boss is at the table, you know, walking him through the markup, and all of a sudden, Congressman so-and-so puts up an amendment. And the boss turns around to the staff and says, anybody know what this is? And man, you don't want to hear that. I mean, because we're looking at each other like, what is this? And this must be really bad because we don't know about it. Where did this come from? And so for the next 4 or 5 days, everybody on the House side is just, hey, whose amendment was that? How much does it cost? And we couldn't figure out what it was. And then Al Hunt, who was the tax reporter for the Wall Street Journal, on Monday morning, I think it was, had a first column, front page Wall Street Journal headline, H. Ross Perot gets $40 million tax break. Woo! and this is back in the days when markups actually went a few weeks. And boy, the members couldn't find a rock big enough to crawl under after that story. And Mr. Perot didn't get his loophole. But, you know, so it's a crazy process. In theory, I like transparency, but you know, again, it's winners and losers, and it's good, bad, and ugly. And if it's in public, it's harder to get things done. And so I'd almost prefer that you do it behind closed doors and then make it public and then don't take it up on the floor for a few weeks and let people really look at it, which is, by the way, not happening now, but let's not get into that. Okay, healthcare and the tax code. Well, first of all, let's look at the spending side. Medicare and Medicaid, $1.3 trillion out of a $3.5 trillion federal budget. That's a pretty big chunk. We just had, Health Affairs just ran an article saying that we spent $3.3 trillion on health care last year. That's a lot of bucks. No other country in the world spends anywhere near that proportion of GDP. We're at about 18%. I just came back from France. We're taking care of my mother-in-law, Southwest France. She's 93. She gets doctor visits at home. If she's going to have an operation, there'll be people 24/7 at her house with her. You know, France spends, I forget, 12.5% of GDP on health care. And the countries that are spending less to have better outcomes. So we're throwing a lot of money at it, and we're not getting the health. And on the tax side, it's even worse, because even though it's not as big, it turns out on the tax side, as in my paper, we're spending, you know, around $200 billion a year through the tax code for health care. Most of it is the employer exclusion for health benefits they give to you. We're the only country in the world that has employers involved in providing health. It makes no sense. But because of World War II price controls, and the only, you know, wages were frozen, and industry couldn't get the workforce it needed, they started giving out health insurance and life insurance as a way to attract a better workforce. And then it came to be a question before the IRS and Treasury as to, oh, is that taxable or not? And it was just an administrative decision. It was never legislated. Okay, it's not taxable. That's how employers got to run healthcare, which, I mean, nobody ever planned it. I mean, nobody ever analyzed it. It just sort of grew like topsy. And so employers aren't so happy about doing that, so they pass it along to all the insurance companies, and then they're telling your doctors they can only give you 15 minutes and whether you can have a transplant. And so, I mean, you just, you know, so getting back to tax policy, you never know when you start a credit or a deduction or a special tax expenditure, whether it's going to loop around and have unintended consequences. And so that's what we're going to get into next. Okay, so why do we knowingly violate the principles of tax policy? At the bottom of page 3 in my paper, I talk about externalities. Anybody name any externalities, especially here in California? Wildfires are an externality. Somebody didn't, clear the land or whatever, and it burned your house. Pollution is the usual example economists turn to of an externality, where like you're buying electricity, but they're burning coal to produce electricity, and the coal pollutes the atmosphere, blah, blah, blah. And so, and there are also positive externalities. Anybody name any positive externalities? Education has all kinds of spin-off effects, right? R&D. These are all things that have positive externalities. Well, in tax policy, the theory is you want to tax the bad things that have bad externalities, like pollution, and you want to give tax subsidies to the beneficial externalities. And so that's one of the ways we end up with a very complicated tax code. Let's take an example. As Sene was talking about smoking, tobacco taxes. Smoking has obvious negative externalities, right? The costs of smoking are not just borne by the smokers. You may be a coworker next to a smoker, and if you come down with lung cancer, that's an externality. That's bad. And so, and even for the smokers themselves, they're addicted. They impose all kinds of healthcare costs that may be unreimbursed. That's an externality. Okay, so we want to tax a bad thing and lower the cost of these externalities. So we put a tax on tobacco. Now, if you tax tobacco production, that could hurt job creation, right? And maybe some of those are being exported, not even consumed in the U.S. So the externality is overseas, it's not domestic. And you don't want to kill jobs in North Carolina and Kentucky. What about fairness? What about vertical equity? Who smokes? There you go, the right answer right here. Poor people smoke much more disproportionately than rich people. So when you put a tax on tobacco, or actually, on cigarette sales, so people like President Obama, who's bumming his cigarettes from staff at the White House or something, I mean, you want to tax the sale. You're hurting poor people. So you always end up with this conflict. It's always a balancing act of trying to develop a tax that isn't too regressive, but gets people to stop smoking, right? So so that brings me to my next topic. How do people react to taxes? Well, in the case of smoking, if you push the price up high enough, maybe you'll stop some people from smoking. That's called tax avoidance, right? That's a good thing. That's what you want. You want them to avoid smoking because it's got a bad externality. Okay, but what happens if you push the tax up pretty high like they have in New York State, where the tax is almost $5 a pack? So the total cost of a pack of cigarettes in New York State is almost $10. Does anybody, there you go. And who's running black market? Well, the Russian mob in New York City has got these semis, smokes going up 95 from North Carolina to New York City. Do you know what proportion? There have been some economists who have actually dug into this. According to a couple of what I think are pretty good papers, do you know what proportion of cigarettes smoked in New York State are not taxed or smuggled in? You got it. Hey, I like audience participation. 57%. 57%. And you're subsidizing the mob, by the way, when you're doing that. So you're creating other externalities. So, okay, so... Go ahead.
But it also has effectively reduced smoking.
Well, yeah, sure, sure.
So that may be an externality. You can pick and choose your externality.
That's true.
The benefit to society of reducing smoking far outweighs those externalities.
But there's a tipping point. And my point is,
There could be, but there's no evidence that we've hit that.
well, $10 a pack and smuggling so that more than half of all the smokes are smuggled in, you're not reducing smoking as much as you think, and you're subsidizing a lot.
I bet we're still reducing smoking.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't analyze anything just around.
I agree.
tax.
General equilibrium is the way to analyze. The trouble is it's pretty hard to do. But anyways, the point is there is going to be some tax rate at which it's too much. And so one of the things that when we were formulating in fact, I was involved in formulating and passing the 82 increase in the tobacco tax. Yeah, go ahead.
You're talking about the impacts
Right,
of all of them have unintended
right.
consequences. They all do, right? So
Right.
and we're all here trying to figure out how to incentivize. Oh, what would you say then about design?
I guess the main point here is start out small, start out with the state governments, and work your way up. And piloting. Yeah, right. I mean, have a big enough tax credit or deduction or whatever, tax exempt bonds, that it can do so you can get some track record of success, right? So you can prove that you reduce some smoking, but not so much that it falls apart, and kind of inch your way up to a level that seems to be optimal. The hard part in all of this is what's the optimal level, right? Because you've got a balancing act between all these principles. And when you have a balancing act, if you push any one of the principles too hard, like you raise the tax way above any other state, there's going to be smuggling, and there's going to be a lot of people who are smoking anyway without paying the tax. And so it's a balancing act. And so my recommendation is that you start out small with some, very well justified, try to have it as cleaned up as you can and get it in at the state level, and then take it up to Capitol Hill in Washington and say, hey, look what we did here, and that's how a lot of that happened. Now, how do we figure out, we had some theory, where we looked at what's called the elasticity of smoking, and it turns out the older people, like say over 25, who are mostly addicted to nicotine, no matter how much you tax them, they're going to keep smoking, right? So their elasticity, that is the percentage change in smoking for this percentage change increase in the price, is about 0.1. But if you split off and just look at the under 25 crowd, their elasticity is like 1, okay? They're not hooked yet. And so one of the important things with a tobacco tax is to have it high enough that you're stopping the young kids from smoking and not getting, when they're over 25 to be addicted. And so it's a balancing act. And so my point in the paper is that if you only looked at the overall elasticity, you wouldn't raise the tax enough. But if you split it apart and look at the piece for the kids and the piece for the older people, then you'll get to a higher number. And so anyways, we presented that analysis to the members, and they looked at it and smiled a little bit and thought, that's too much. We got to talk to our friends from North Carolina and Kentucky, and they're not going to go for this big a tax increase. And so you know what our next line of assault was to raise the tobacco tax? Well, when was the last time it was raised? 1951. Now, what happens when you have a fixed dollar amount of anything in a law? Yes, the impact automatically declines with inflation, right? So we said to the members, well, gee, you know, if we took into account the inflation from 1951 to 1982, it's about, if we just brought the tax up to the level it was before, it'll double the tax. And that was less than we had recommended, but it was better than nothing. And so that's how we decided how much to increase the tobacco tax in 1982. Just showing them that it was just restoring it to what economists call the same real value that it was after you take into account the inflation. Yes? Turn it on. Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, you're on.
Thanks. So if you take that argument, you mentioned sort of state level activity.
Right,
So if, let's talk taxing cigarettes.
right.
So how much, looking at sort of lines of attack as you describe, around regional tax rates matter in making determinations, you know, whether it was 20, 30 years ago, and considerations with surrounding states in making determinations on where you sit relative to a tax rate. Your opinion about that, you know, as opposed to maybe even thinking more nationally, because as you think about trying to set a rate, it sounds more arbitrary than I had imagined in some of this discussion. So thanks.
Yes, I mean, this is a good point. When you're making tax policy and you've got people living in sort of rich cities like San Francisco and you got people living in poor communities like, I don't know, what, Bakersfield or whatever, and you got Washington and then you've got rural Virginia or something, again, you get into really difficult decisions about how to set one tax rate that's fair for everybody. Usually, in those situations, what I say is, don't set a fixed dollar amount, right? Because it's going to be wrong for a lot of people, and it's going to be too low for the people in the rich communities, it's going to be too high for the people in the poor communities. So you set a percentage, right? And ad valorem is usually a better way to go. The trouble is, when you do that, then people, you know, all the tax lawyers start figuring out ways to chip away at the base, you know, what you're multiplying the percentage times. So what happens in the case of cigarettes? There's 8 different taxes on tobacco. There's small cigarettes that most people are smoking, but you know, what about cigars? Well, cigars are totally different. I mean, you know, we won't tax them as much, except that cigars are smoked by rich people. And so, in my opinion, you should tax cigars more. But that was back in the days when there were actually people from Cuba down in Miami rolling cigars, and we didn't want to put them out of jobs. And so you know, you get into all these considerations that play on the minds of legislators as they're trying to figure out how to craft one of these things. And so it's a difficult problem trying to have a uniform policy when you've got very diverse communities that have wide variations in income, wide variations in expenses, and the way they live. And tax policy is complicated in part because of those differences. And all I can say to you is that that's the legislator's job, is to make those tough decisions.
Hey, Pete, we have about
Yeah.
20, 25 minutes
keep
left.
going.
I know you
Yep.
want to talk about tax credits and deductions.
I do,
and
I do.
We want to take some more questions as well.
I do. Okay, let's move on. I'll skip over a lot of things. Okay, we've talked about excise taxes a lot. Let's go to income taxes. So when you look at income taxes, I mean, you've got income times marginal tax rates equals tax, right? And marginal tax rates, if you look at this schedule, you know, it says if your income is, or after deductions is between 0 and whatever number, the tax rate is like 12%, and then it goes up to like 39.6. It's graduated rates. And that's in keeping with the principle of taxation that the more your income, the more you should pay. Well, when you take that total tax number divided by the total income, that's your average tax rate, right? And so it matters a lot what's in the base. There's three kinds of tax expenditures. One is above the line. Everybody who files a tax return gets a deduction for like moving expenses or other costs of producing your income. So when I file my Schedule C, I take my gross receipts, I subtract off, you know, my expenses for publications and my expenses for whatever, taxi cabs and computers and whatever, and I get a net income, and that goes on to my 1040, and then I pay, you know, tax. Okay, then there are itemized deductions. These are things like the medical expense in excess of 10%, charitable contributions, home mortgage interest, and a whole range of others. Only 25% of taxpayers itemize. So whenever you're giving somebody an itemized deduction, you're basically saying that 1/4 of the taxpayers should get a lower tax that in effect is subsidized by the other 3/4 of taxpayers. Yes, only 1/4 of taxpayers, and mostly the taxpayers in the top 30, 40% of the income distribution itemize, right? They're not claiming the standard deduction. These are people who, almost all of them own homes. And a lot of them give money to charity. Not too many of them have medical expense in excess of 10% of income. And so those deductions lower their tax relative to the other 3/4 of taxpayers. So my kids who are renting are effectively subsidizing my home ownership. And home ownership has externalities. I mean, right? You know, the more people in their homes, safer the communities, the better the upkeep of the housing. You know, so there are some reasons. You know, you want to employ more construction trades, you know, builders, realtors. You know, I mean, there are reasons.
You want to incentivize charitable donations.
Right, exactly. We'll get to that in a minute. But it's good, bad, and the ugly again. I mean, it's kind of unfair for my kids to be subsidizing me and my wife to live in a multi-million-dollar home. My wife here hates to have me say this, but in my opinion, it's clear. And so they're trying to chip away at that right now on the Hill in the tax bill. And I assure you that all the home builders and realtors are just clamoring to avoid a little bit of a hit on the very highest home mortgage interest deductors. Charities, sure, you know, you give money to a church does good things, great. A friend of mine just became, 2 years ago, became chancellor of the University of Wisconsin. So I was kidding her about how cold she was going to be sitting at football games. And then I asked her, how much, give me the multiple of your salary that the football coach gets. And the answer was 3. Football coach gets paid 3 times the amount that the chancellor who's in charge of the university gets. And then you go to the stadium and they got all this advertising and they got all these, I mean, you know, it's not good. And what about the players? I would argue, and I know this is controversial, in my opinion, it's the last form of slavery. Poor football players, and you know what happens when they get hurt? They lose their scholarships. They don't even get health care. And I asked her, I said, how can you let that happen? That's just terrible. At least you should give them health care at the university and let them graduate. And she says, Pete, it's a violation of NCAA rules. That's just wrong. Okay, final thing on charities. They get charitable deductions for contributions to the university. Well, I'll give you how it works. My brother and his buddies get tickets on the 50-yard line at UW, and because of the tax code, those tickets are only priced at $75. But to get in the pool, to get those tickets, you got to give 50 grand to the university, and that's a charitable deduction. tax lawyers at work. And so, what about Pittsburgh, the University Medical Center of Pittsburgh, or whatever it's called, 2013, the mayor of Pittsburgh sued the local hospital because it wasn't caring for poor people well enough. It was finding ways to sort of shove them out the door. And so they actually ended up suing their hospital. A subsequent mayor ended the suit and cut a deal. And the hospital promised to become a quote-unquote better neighbor. And so, sure, you know, I mean, if people really are out there, you know, feeding the homeless and building low-income housing and whatever, and really doing it and really helping people, hey, charitable deduction's fine. But remember, it's only a quarter of the taxpayers who are getting that benefit. Most poor people aren't going to be able to give a whole lot, or even middle-income people give a lot to charity. Middle income maybe giving something as much as they can to their church. But when you're talking about colleges and universities and hospitals and building a wing here and doing a museum there, you're talking about really rich people who have savings. And so, again, it's a balancing act between principles. You want the charitable purpose, but you're giving a break to really rich people. And so, again, there's always a conflict, no matter what you do in tax policy. And
Pete?
so, yeah.
I'm sorry, do you want to make some maybe closing comments, and then we can open it up to some additional questions?
Sure. Well, let me do a couple of quick things. I mean, it's 9:38, so. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is the thing I'm most proud of. Milton Friedman came up with the idea, and I got to talk to him a few times when I was a student at Rochester. I had no idea I was going to end up passing this. Pat Moynihan was on the Domestic Council at the White House. He pushed it. Nixon proposed it before he got knocked out and before he resigned. And then we went home in the end of '74 with whip inflation buttons now. It was the oil embargo. Gas prices were through the roof. And we came back in January, and the economy was in free fall. And we needed an immediate tax cut to stop the economy from going into a big recession, which we did. And so I was told, you got $8 billion, create a negative income tax. And we did. Now, the people who had earnings were going to get a credit, and we had those on the computer model, but we didn't have the people who were not filing tax returns, who might become employed. And the whole reason for the credit, the whole justification, the whole reason Milton Friedman thought of the idea, poor people were better off if they stayed on welfare than if they got a job. And so we had to change that equation so that poor people would be better off if they took a job. And we're talking mostly about women with kids who couldn't afford daycare. And so, you know, we had to give them a fair amount of money. Well, what happens when you start putting money on the table like that? You better make sure they qualify, right? And so, fortunately, the precursor of HHS, HEW, had just created a model of the very poorest people in the country, and we got some of that data, and we used it to sort of create a sub-model, and we created an earned income tax credit. It went into the law. 2 years later, when the data came out, we were the most surprised people in the world to find out we actually nailed the estimate. You know, this was an estimate where we were just terrified this thing could be off by 100%, and it came in right at $8 billion. Now, how big is the program today? $77 billion per year. That is a huge program. And what portion of it is fraud? $15 billion worth. That was a number a few years ago. They've cut it back a way back. But still, whenever you expand a program, you start getting fraud. And so that's a problem. Another quick one is the Targeted Jobs Tax Credit, or which we call now the Work Opportunity Credit. When I was hired in 1981 by Pete Domenici on the Budget Committee, a Republican Budget Committee chair, when you go in to meet the senator, you know, you're pretty much hired. So I walk in with the chief of staff and the alleged director, and I was standing there in front of Domenici. He stands up, shakes my hand, sits back down, and says, "Hey, what about this targeted jobs tax credit anyways?" And my mouth dropped open, and, I go like this. And he says, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Well, sir, other than the fact that it doesn't work and that President Reagan wants to repeal it, nothing." And there's this dead silence, and I'm thinking, yeah, I'm going to talk myself out of a job here pretty quick, and I better come up with a good rejoinder. And I did, because, I was an experienced staffer. I said, "Sir, I understand the drill. We're going to extend this credit. Do I have authority to clean it up and make it work?" And he said yes, and I got hired. And what was happening was tax lawyers were going around the country to all the HR departments and saying, "I can reduce your taxes by 3 or 4 times my fee." And they were going in and finding the people who already had jobs who qualified for the credit and helped the company apply for the credit. Well, that didn't create one job. I mean, that was all retroactive. So I got rid of the retroactivity. In '82, we got rid of the retroactivity. It works a little better now. And so under income taxes, in my opinion, credits are better. You can keep track of them easier. If it's a deduction, you're not so sure. The data takes longer to show up. You have to try and guess at what the marginal rates are that apply to it to find out. So, and deductions only affect a quarter of the taxpayers. Credits go to everybody. So, credits are probably a better way to go if you're looking for funding. They're more easily designed. I'll just mention real quick that the low-income housing credit doesn't go to the poor. It goes to builders, it goes to syndicators, and it goes to the lawyers who do the paperwork. There have been several studies to show that it's a real ripoff. And you got to be careful with tax-exempt bonds, too. Here again, there's a lot of good tax-exempt bond stuff. In fact, this building was probably built with them. However, if you're building a sports stadium, maybe in the long run that's helping the community, but it's probably pushing the poor out. And I have a buddy who testifies, he's probably the only economist in the country who testifies against building sports stadiums with tax-exempt bonds. And there are several studies showing that when you finance a new stadium with tax-exempt bonds, then the education budget gets whacked. And so, yeah.
Oh.
I guess there's some public record of this and all of that. I just remember in the course of our reading, and I'm looking back at my colleague Maggie Cook, about the actual, I don't know, you said LIHTC doesn't work and that it's not effective. And in my reading, it's about 25% that comes off the top. So again, I don't want to leave this community with the impression that it just flat out doesn't work.
No.
But there is some kind of level of leakage. Is that the number, 25%? Yeah, yeah. Right. So, I mean, the point is, again, I really am appreciating your stories. I think they're great. I want us to have some element of hope that, that we can actually figure this out, understanding that it's not all a complete disaster.
I would point out on the low-income housing credit, there is a requirement on the income of the renters that they have to put into the building, and that's a pretty important part. And so that's a good example of something that you can put into a policy to try and make sure it works. But there's more work to be done. And so, in closing, I mean, again, every time you do anything in tax policy, it's a balancing act among the principles of raising revenue, vertical fairness, horizontal fairness, simplicity, transparency, efficiency, and there's always winners and losers. The losers care 3 times more than the winners, and good, bad, and ugly.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Pete. I've seen a few people put up their hands for questions. Let's go to the back. Was there another comment, question about LIHTC, the low-income housing tax credit? Great, let's go here and then here.
Okay, I was just going to add two other sort of unintended consequences of LIHTC is that only about
People introduce themselves as well.
Oh, hi, I'm Maggie Cook. I'm with the Ripple Foundation and Rethink Health. Only about 17% of LIHTC properties are actually built in high-performing school districts, areas of opportunity. So we would kind of pose that that perpetuates cycles of poverty. And also there's still a very large population of severely rent-burdened people who still can't afford the AMI of LIHTC. So they still have nowhere to go, even though there is, that program's created over 3 million affordable housing units.
Yeah, and some have called for state qualified allocation plans that specifically incentivize using the credits in high opportunity neighborhoods. So let's go here, please.
I'm Phyllis Meadows from the Kresge Foundation, and Pete, thank you for your stories and for your presentation. I'm one of those beginner ones. I couldn't get the technology to work, but I don't even know if my hand would have gone up at all. But I wanted to just, you've shared a lot about the sort of the impact of some of these policies, these tax credit policies. I'm just trying to get a better understanding of the intent. So for the low-income housing tax credit,
Right.
what was the intent? You know, what was sort of the drivers for that policy and such that it would end up being, the impact being that it would benefit
Well, I
the
mean,
wealthy?
builders and
Was it designed for building? Wasn't designed for poor people?
they thought the low-income housing credit was going to benefit poor people, and on its face, it builds more low-income housing. It does do that. The question is, what kind of housing, where, and how much better off are the poor people? And the studies are showing that the poor people aren't that much better off. They're somewhat better off, but a lot of the benefit goes elsewhere. And so that's the problem. And I should also point out that with the way we've had the big shift in the income distribution in this country, the stock of low-income housing, this is one of the things I forgot to mention earlier, since 2010 has declined by 60%. So the amount, so here you have a credit that's trying to create more low-income housing, but meanwhile there's other factors going on that have slashed the amount of actual existing low-income housing. We're not rehabbing old structures that poor people used to be able to move into. If you come to D.C., you know, I spend a fair amount of time through my church with various poor people, and there are hardly any poor people left in D.C. proper. There are a few little isolated spots along North Capitol Street. If you go over to Anacostia, which used to be the really bad neighborhood, it's all gentrified now. I mean, you know, and so poor people, one last story. I used to run my church. We're a lay-led church, you know, the old Puritan church, the Congregationalist United Church of Christ. And so we're sitting there at a governance council meeting a few years ago debating about raising the janitor's pay to $15 an hour and giving him health insurance. He's third generation who's taken care of our building. And I'm saying, come on, we're rich, let's do this. And there was actually debate about it. And one person said, well, gee, you know, he could live up in Gaithersburg and not have to commute from all the way where he's commuting. I mean, you know, and so I go down and I say, hey, Martell, how come you're not living in Gaithersburg? And he says, Pete, where have you been? Rents up there are twice what they are where I am, and that's why I'm living 10 miles past Andrews Air Force Base in PG County. And he's driving for an hour to take care of our church. And we're debating about whether to give him $15 in health care. Fortunately, the minister weighed in and we did it. But, I mean, those are the kinds of issues that you get into when you're trying to figure out how to get people better housed, give them an earned income tax credit so they can make it, and the payroll taxes won't, and the loss of benefits won't overwhelm their decision to work. And so, you know, I wish these issues were simple. I wish there was clear solutions, but like I say, you're better off just working toward the right thing. You know, this is not revolution time, because when you make the big grab for something and then you fail, that just sets you back. But if you can just get a foot in the door and then build on it and show progress and, you know, expand the program.
So just a quick note, I think Pete was commenting on both the fairness principle and the efficiency principle. Additionally, the Bipartisan Policy Center just put out a paper on the low-income housing tax credit and its health effects that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation just helped support. So there's another resource for people, because I think this sometimes does come down to how we value the intended and unintended consequences, and I think Pete has done a nice job of sort of walking us through that, but almost every single question gets at this issue of values. So let's take the next question. Yes, please.
Hi, this is Anna with Human Impact Partners here in Oakland, and I loved your question, and I sort of have a follow-up, which is, what would your recommendation be to change those drivers? So who's in the room that is making those decisions of intent, and how do we shift that so that the discussion doesn't have to go through, well, you know, somebody that's that micro example of just not understanding the perspective of somebody who's actually living the experience of being a low-income person, low-income paid worker. So what's your recommendation for changing who's in the room and how we change the intent of tax policymaking?
That's a really tough question. There's a group in Montgomery County, Maryland called Action in Montgomery. And it's a coalition of all the churches and synagogues and mosques and charitable groups. And one of their main focuses has been to improve low-income housing in one of the richest counties in the country. And the county board, you know, makes all these promises and says, you know, we're gonna do this for low-income housing, and we're gonna do that. And, you know, maybe they even adopt a policy, but then there's not enough money. And it's like you just have to show up every single board meeting. You have to pack the room, and you have to hold their feet to the fire. And it's hard to do. Montgomery County has got a reasonably good record on low-income housing. I mean, it's not terrible, and I'm not saying the board is terrible or the mayor or the county executive is terrible, but it's tough because home builders don't make a lot of money building low-income housing units. And when they try to build them too close to the rich people, they object. And so, you know, it's a battle all the time. And, you know, Action in Montgomery is not making huge PAC contributions to the reelection of county board members like the home builders are. And so one of the things I haven't got into here is what I call the sewer of campaign finance, which is really bad at the federal level. I mean, you think your congressmen and senators are spending full time, you know, trying to figure out, I don't know, how to fund the government and how to do the tax bill and whatever? No. Last Friday, I was at a breakfast meeting of my tax lobbyist buddies like I do every Friday, and one of my good young House conservative Republican tax staff was talking to us off the record. And I won't quote what he said, but basically, he's working day and night trying to get this tax bill together, and then he has to go across the street off the hill into the National Republican Campaign headquarters and call donors for his boss. And so your congressmen and senators are spending anywhere from 20 to 50% of their time just dialing for dollars. That's not what we want. It's not what the Founding Fathers intended.
Let's see if we can take maybe one more question.
I'll just add a codicil there. When you show up and when you get people to vote, you can counter all that, but you have to show up. And that's where it matters. And you have to make sure your voting records are right. There's a lot of effort to you know, try and remove people who are dead and whatever, but sometimes they're removing people who are legally allowed to vote, or they change the voting place and you go to the wrong place and you can't vote. So before each election, people need to check and make sure they're properly registered. And, that's the way things should be working, and hopefully we can improve our terrible tax code. Thank you very much.
Let's thank Pete Davis. So we're going to have many, many more opportunities to engage in discussion and debate and civil dialogue about these issues. Thanks to Pete for walking us through the typology of taxation, design principles, and really offering us some really great behind-the-scenes examples of how tax policy gets made. We are going to take a break and get started again with our next session at 10:10. And just as a way of transition, I'll close with this quote from Lyndon Johnson. And it harkens back to our introduction. So he said in 1790, the nation, which had fought a revolution against taxation without representation, discovered that some of its citizens weren't much happier about taxation with representation. So there's always another problem to solve, and maybe we will come to some solutions later today. Thanks so much, and 10:10, be back for the next session.